Good evening. Um, I find the discussion very interesting and informative, and I'm happy that I did stumble across it from the Facebook page. My question deals with the question of racism. Obviously, in the context of what is happening in Guyana for the past 6 months, we've seen racism in its most overt and its most virulent forms, and the racism that we see is on both sides. And of course, we know that we all have our own unconscious biases. There's no doubt, but we sort of, those of us who are intelligent enough can do association and disabuse ourselves of those biases. Mr. Alexander spoke about some important concepts, and so did Mr. Hughes. They spoke about institutional racism. They spoke about stereotyping and all these sort of concepts that inform how people view others. I don't necessarily agree that we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as South Africa had, because South Africa's history is completely different from Guyana. So any sort of action taken in respect to Guyana has to be within its own local framework. Mr. Alexander has a prominent role to play in Guyana, not only because he sat on the Elections Commission, but because of his own work with African Guyanese history. So I think what I would want to hear from him is, in the domestic context, having regard to Guyana's own local and domestic history, what local tribunal or commission or symposium or forum can be birthed at this present time, so that some form of healing can happen between mostly Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese. Obviously, the situation as it is right now cannot continue. So perhaps he can answer that question, and I thank you for giving me the time.
Our problem requires a multifaceted approach. There's no one thing, and it's not linear. It's not linear. Multifaceted and multidimensional. I think we, in fact, at the level of the leadership of the country, there has to be admission of the problem that exists. We may have to force them to get to that point. But once there's that admission, then that should lead to a national conversation. A national conversation where across the country, we have various fora where we talk about the problem and the solution. Because one of the problems we have is a non-admission that there is a problem or what the problem is. So we need to get the leadership to come to an understanding of the existence of a problem and to have a conversation about that. Now, I noticed in two papers 2 days ago, Clement Rui making the point of the need for the conversation. Now, he said some other things I don't necessarily agree with, but I think he came around eventually to saying there is an ethnic race problem, is a need for a conversation. And we need more of the leaders in this society to come on board and to start that conversation across the country. But as I said, I think the approach to our solution is multifaceted. I think there's an incremental approach that should occur, and that is the one that should occur through the education system. Incremental approach. I think there's a governance approach which should also be embraced, a governance approach which allows for decentralization in a manner that in our ethnic communities, we can do much of what needs to be done for ourselves with the resources, rather than to be competing at the national level for resources and then having a government that is biased, treating one community as opposed to the other. So I think that a lot of devolution, not only devolution in terms of political devolution, but in terms of fiscal devolution, could allow for communities to be held responsible and therefore not being in a position to lay blame at somebody else's doorstep if things don't go the way they want them to go. So we have to have that kind of public policy that allows for our resources to be used. And we're doing this in some regards in relation to the indigenous people. We don't necessarily articulate what we're doing for indigenous people as a process of quality equalization through equity, where resources are being disproportionately deployed because they are behind to bring them up. And so we need to look at where the other groups are and in their local environment, see how we could deploy resources to give them the opportunity to do things for themselves and not to be subject to a competition at the central level, and then the central people in quest for power handing out, and then when the elections come around, in quest for ensuring the people who will hand out you in power, then you vote for them. So it's a very dynamic approach I think is required. Education on one hand, which is the incremental approach, devolution, which allows the people to have more independence in determining the fate of their communities, and then conversation that will lower the level of antagonism, with people having antagonistic views about each other, rather than coming around to have respectful and mutual views about each other. So it's a very multifaceted approach that is required. It requires, on one hand, commitment of the leadership, but I think it also requires a groundswell that pushes the leadership in that direction of commitment.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander, for responding. Because we